Hello English students, you're watching AQA English, where we are working hard to give you analysis of GCSE and A-level texts. This video lesson is focused on Blood Brothers, and it's going to provide you with a very quick plot summary of the entire play, useful revision tool. So sit right back and let me tell you the story of Blood Brothers. Wait, don't do this in an exam. What's about to follow in this video is basically a narrative retelling of the plot of Blood Brothers, and sometimes when you're writing an essay it's easy to slip into doing this yourself, into retelling the story. Blood Brothers is a really good story and it's a really good one to retell, but if you find yourself slipping into narrative and retelling the story, try and stop yourself and move back to the question. To be clear, you can explain the context of whatever reference you're making. You need to maybe say what's happened before it or what it's leading up to, but you really need to avoid retelling large chunks of the story. If you look online on YouTube, there is a recorded performance from the 80s of Blood Brothers. It's old school VHS grainy quality, but the performance itself is really good, and it's divided into 10 sections. 5 in the first act and 5 in the second act, and I think those 10 sections make a really good way to break down the text, which is what I'm going to do for you here. So to begin with, in section 1, the narrator first introduces a scene where we have 2 dead bodies lying on the floor, and he challenges the audience to judge how events unfold. And then Mrs. Johnson comes on, and her backstory is introduced through the song Marilyn Monroe. Now, this first section establishes Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons mostly as parallel characters, but contrasting characters. We realise that Mrs. Johnson is a struggling working class woman, whereas Mrs. Lyons is a affluent middle class woman. So they're juxtaposed. And Russell is creating a kind of an ironic contrast between the women through the song My Child at the end. We get this irony of Mrs. Lyons desperately wants children but can't have any, and Mrs. Johnson actually needs to stop having children but somehow she can't stop herself from having them. So there's a kind of an irony here presented through their similar desires but their contrasting situations. The final song, My Child, presents them in a kind of a parallel way. It's a duet, and they are united by their loving motherly instincts in this song. In the second section then, we get introduced to Mrs. Lyons' plan. So the relationship between Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons is developing, and we start to see that Mrs. Lyons can be highly manipulative, where she uses Mrs. Johnson's superstitious fears and anxieties against her and uses this to coerce her into surrendering her child. We then get the song Easy Terms, which is a way of exploring Mrs. Johnson's inner turmoil and her feelings of helplessness as her baby is taken away from her, much like the way the catalogue and the finance men take away her material possessions. So we see that Mrs. Johnson's low status in this section is what enables Mrs. Lyons to threaten her with arrest. And finally, when Mrs. Johnson tries to break the pact, Mrs. Lyons is really dishonest and controlling. She sacks Mrs. Johnson, she threatens her using her superstition, and then she symbolically buys her off with £50. And at the very end of this section, we have a kind of a flash forward in time, which leads us to Mickey being 8 years old. And we get the song at the beginning of section 3, I Wish I Was Our Sammy. It's not really a song, it's actually a kind of a poem that Mickey recites on stage. So Mickey is instantly a kind of an energetic and comic presence on stage. And in the poem, I Wish I Was Our Sammy, he expresses his admiration for his antisocial brother, and this eventually foreshadows him following Sammy into a life of crime. Mickey and Eddie then meet on stage, and they form an instant connection, despite, as we the audience see, their very, very different upbringings. They each have very different knowledge, they each have very different language. Now they decide to become blood brothers and create this kind of blood pact on stage when they're oblivious to the fact that they're real brothers, and that's a powerful dramatic irony for the audience, who obviously know that they are in fact real brothers. So our understanding of this irony, or the fact that this dramatic irony, how we know the truth but the boys themselves don't, that gets sharpened when each of the boys takes the other home to meet their mother. And that forms a reminder for us, because we're 8 years later, of Mrs. Johnston and or nearly 8 years later. It forms a reminder for the audience of Mrs. Johnston and Mrs. Lyons' guilty secrets, as they're both presented with the missing twin. In section 4, we have the chaotic kids song, and shortly after we get Mickey showing his sadness at the thought of his own death. And this is a kind of a foreshadowing as well. Linda is there to care for Mickey, and she's presented as a thoughtful character who consoles him. And her and Sammy in some ways are kind of contrasting characters, in that Sammy is threatening and violent, and Linda is loving and caring, and they have sort of competing influence on Mickey, in that is presented later when Mickey has to decide kind of which direction he goes in, whether he goes with Linda or whether he goes with Sammy. The three characters then, Eddie, Linda and Mickey, become a kind of a mischievous trio, and they get up to mischief, being caught in vandalism, etc., which is all great fun. Mrs. Lyons is presented in this section as having a deteriorating mental state. She has a bit of a meltdown over Eddie's relationship with Mickey. It's clear that she's got unresolved guilt about her actions, and this is presented when the song Gypsies in the Wood is aimed at her, a way of kind of exploring Mrs. Johnston's growing paranoia. Finally, after Eddie and Mickey get in trouble in this section, Eddie's father decides to move the family to the country, presumably for Mrs. Lyons' well-being and her sanity. And as a farewell, we see Mrs. Johnston giving Eddie the secret locket with a picture of her twin inside, which will later become relevant. The final section in Act 1 then is mostly the farewell between Eddie and Mickey, in which Eddie symbolically offers Mickey a gun as a leaving present. And this is a powerful symbol in the play that is going to foreshadow the following violence. Obviously there are guns in Act 2 as well, but the guns in Act 2, rather than being toys, are real. When Eddie begins his life in the country, he's presented as isolated and sad, and Mickey is presented separately on the other side of the stage as having a meaningless life without his twin. So this is their second separation, in a sense. So they were separated as newborn babies, and they're now being separated again at 8 years old. And the musical number My Friend, which is a duet, kind of juxtaposes these identical feelings, showing that they're separate but they have their identical feelings. To end this act, Mrs. Johnston gets a letter, which is the good news. The Johnstons are being relocated out of their central slum housing and into a new housing estate outside of the city centre. Mrs. Johnston is jubilant, and she and her family rejoices in this opportunity to transform their life, and the act ends on a very positive note with the song Bright New Day. As Act 2 begins, once again the Marilyn Monroe song is used to move action forward, just as it was to explore Mrs. Johnston's backstory in Act 1. It now covers the interval between the children being 8 up to their early teenage years. We're shown that Mrs. Johnston is doing well and she's settled in her new life, and then we get a series of parallel scenes that juxtapose Eddie and Mickey. We get them juxtaposed as they're leaving for school, and we also get them juxtaposed at school, showing the very different educational opportunities that they have. Mickey significantly is presented in this section really through his relationships with other people. He's very embarrassed about his attraction to Linda, and particularly her flirting with him deeply embarrasses him. His relationship with his mother is kind of playful and fun. Mrs. Johnson takes a lot of joy in teasing Mickey about being in love with Linda, and their relationship altogether is shown as sort of a warm and caring one. And then finally, Mickey's relationship with his brother Sammy is that he's exposed to Sammy's shocking, violent behaviour and Sammy's directionless life on the dole. And this is something that Linda says to him, "I hope you don't go this way." We also get a moment here where the bus conductor comes out of character as the narrator to challenge Mrs. Johnson, and that acts for us as a reminder of the guilty secret that is sort of a hangover from Act 1, is still there in the consciousness of Mrs. Johnson and later Mrs. Lyons. Eddie is sent home from school, as is Mickey, for misbehaving. They both have similar attitudes and troubles, problems with authority. But when Edward is sent home, he refuses to explain where he gets the locket from to Mrs. Lyons, and this causes her to sort of relapse into her paranoia, and the narrator appears and targets his song "The Devil's Got Your Number," this time at Mrs. Lyons. In the 7th section, Mickey and Eddie are once more united. Before they sing a duet similar to Long Sunday Afternoon in Act 1, where they are separate but presented as being identical. And that's the duet "That Guy." They both are ironically admiring each other, and of course we know that they are they're twins, but they don't. So there's a heavy irony here. Their instant connection is presented once again, just as it is in Act 1. They're playful, they're energetic, they're full of these unfulfilled desires, and Mrs. Johnson teases them both about this. Mrs. Johnson's manner with the two boys is relaxed and fun-loving, and this is a contrast with Mrs. Lyons' increasing instability. Mrs. Lyons sees Eddie going with Mickey, and she then follows them to Mrs. Johnson's house, where she confronts Mrs. Johnson in the kitchen. And the confrontational scene in the kitchen presents a kind of reversal in status of the two women, compared to perhaps the sacking of Mrs. Johnson in Act 1, where Mrs. Lyons was powerful and Mrs. Johnson was vulnerable. We now see that Mrs. Lyons is vulnerable and in a very fragile mental state, whereas Mrs. Johnson is much more confident. And importantly, Mrs. Johnson refuses to be bought off with money in this case. So meanwhile, Mickey, Eddie and Linda, they are presented after the boys visit the cinema as kind of reunited as a trio, and they enjoy a kind of idyllic teenage years as the summer sequence montage progresses, this sort of nostalgic presentation of their carefree youth. The narrator offers a commentary during the summer sequence, which sort of foreshadows the terrible events to come and gives the audience an understanding that things are not going to be this perfect and this ideal for very long. Because things change in section 8. First of all, Eddie leaves for university, and before he does, he acts as the matchmaker connecting Mickey and Linda. But he also sings the song "I'm Not Saying a Word," which presents very clearly to the audience Eddie's own frustrated desire towards Linda, and that's going to become an important part of the plot of Act 2. Mickey and Linda then finally begin their relationship, and similarly to Mrs. Johnson in Act 1, Linda immediately is expecting a child. The eventual wedding that takes place on stage takes place in the form of a montage during the song "Take a Letter, Miss Jones," in which Mr. Lyons is sacking his workers. So this is a way of presenting the way that Mickey becomes unemployed at a key moment in his life, as he's a father of a young family and a newlywed young man. The juxtaposition of those two, the joyful event and the tragedy of unemployment in the song, actually features as a kind of a turning point in the play. For now, for Mickey, events take a rapid downward spiral as his life kind of unravels. This change in his personality is presented quite clearly when Eddie returns from university at Christmas and the two of them argue. Eddie is very insensitive towards Mickey's injured pride. Eddie shows his kind of arrogance and his lack of understanding towards the problems of a working class young man might face, and in response Mickey is violent and bitter. So that scene acts as a contrast with the earlier interactions of the boys, presenting the effects of unemployment, the effects of, I guess, adult reality compared to childhood freedom and innocence. The boys finally separate at the end of this section, and they are not seen together on stage until the finale. So they go their separate ways for a final time here. In section 9, events become much darker, and Russell uses split staging to stage these two key proposals. Eddie and Linda are on one side of the stage, and Eddie proposes to Linda to marry him, although he then learns that Mickey has actually beaten him to it. On the other side of the stage, Sammy proposes to Mickey that they launch together in a career of crime with the robbery of the petrol station. So symbolically on stage, these two are divided, and that represents the divide between the two friends, but also helps create this atmosphere of secrecy and betrayal. We then get the presentation of the robbery, which has got parallels to the earlier kids' song in Act 1, with the difference that this time the guns, of course, are real, and the consequences are tragic as a man is killed. Mickey is arrested and sentenced, and Mrs. Johnson sings the song Marilyn Monroe, which acts as a montage covering Mickey's time in prison and his eventual release. The song Marilyn Monroe, this is the third occurrence of the song in the play, but this time the tempo is very slow because it describes Mickey's deterioration, his vulnerability, and his pitiful state, really. At home, we get a representation of Mickey's relationship with Linda, and we see that Mickey's addiction to antidepressants has really destroyed his marriage and ruined his relationship with Linda. The narrator appears to offer us Linda's perspective. Her life is a life of drudgery, domestic boredom, being married to an unpredictable and detached husband. And finally in this section we see that Linda decides to contact Eddie. The affair between Linda and Eddie that results is narrated by Mrs. Johnson in the song Light Romance, which is sung to the same tune as Easy Terms in Act 1. Mrs. Johnson's lyrics to the song describe the relationship in very casual terms, which is quite ironic because, as we can see in the audience, it's a devastating betrayal for Mickey. In the stage directions, it clearly states that Mrs. Lyons alerts Mickey to the affair. This takes place silently at the back of the stage. And we then get this sudden and violent change in tempo as Mickey realises what is happening between Eddie and Linda. The music changes to Madman, there are lighting changes, but there's a tempo change in the action on stage, and we get Mickey frantically searching for his gun, chased down by Linda and Mrs. Johnson. Mickey arrives at the council chamber having found the gun, where he interrupts Eddie's meeting, and then there is a standoff where Mickey, at gunpoint, accuses Eddie of fathering his child. The police arrive and they try to defuse this standoff, but Mrs. Johnson breaks through the police barrier to reveal the true identity of the two boys. In keeping with the curse, this is their final moments. Mickey expresses his sorrow that he wasn't chosen to be the upper class one, that he wasn't the one taken, and he then shoots Eddie and is shot by the police. What we then see is the scene that was presented at the very opening of the play, with the two bodies lying on the floor. And by means of a finale, Mrs. Johnson stands over the corpses of her two dead twins and is joined by the cast in singing "Tell Me It's Not True." And that concludes the play. So, in terms of summarising, the play covers a span of about 30 years, going right the way back from Mrs. Johnson's very first relationships to the death of her twins. And the events are presented, as we see through Act 1 and Act 2, in a chronological order, but there are significant sections. A section before the birth, exploring Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons' relationship, Mickey and Eddie's lives as they are approaching 8 years old and their childhood. Then into Act 2 we get a presentation of Mickey and Eddie as early teenagers. Things move forward as Eddie leaves for university and they are both around 18 or 19. And then finally, after Mickey comes out of prison, we get a presentation of the boys as adults. So there are, I guess, kind of key moments within the lives of the boys that are presented on stage, and often there's montages that move us between. It's also worth noting that the final scene is presented at the opening, so there is a kind of a circularity. That's the one example of a kind of a non-chronological sequence of events where actually we're presented with the end at the very beginning during the narrator's challenge. As I hope was clear through the summary that I gave, there are lots of parallel scenes and connections that can be made between events, particularly in Act 1 and in Act 2, and it's really worth thinking carefully about the way that different events in the play can connect to show themes like growing up, the difference, for example, in the boys playing as children to the way the boys behave as adults, a kind of a structural contrast. There you go, that's a very quick summary of the play in roughly 20 minutes. It'd be a useful idea for you to complete in your notes a kind of a rough summary of the events as they unfold. Remember not to retell events as you're writing an essay, because that won't gain you credit, but do remember to revise the plot so that you can be really good at selecting the kinds of events to talk about given a particular theme. This is Excel English. Thank you for your focus. Please check the channel, subscribe, and check out which other videos are available for the text that you're studying. And most importantly, good luck with your studies. Bye!